Hey, what's up, everybody? It's John Miller. So, episode 5, which was intended to be one thing, ran a little long, and I thought the best thing to do for everybody, given the length and the amount of information I covered, would be to split it into 2 parts. So, the first part is going to deal with the first 2 questions that I asked, the first of which has to do with the English in Ireland, the second of which has to do with Native Americans and what was going on with them before the English really got started colonizing what would be the United States in earnest. And the second part is going to deal with the different colonies, the original 13 colonies, and what their identities are. So part 1 will be questions 1 and 2 about the English in Ireland and about Native Americans. And part 2 will be about the original 13 colonies and just some fundamentals about what they were, how they started, and what they would become. Okay? Enjoy. Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. Today, we're going to get into episode 5, which I've called British North America is Planted. And there's a very specific reason for that terminology over other ways that I could have put it. It is how the English put it back when they first began to colonize North America, and how they actually had put it when they started to colonize other places, which is something that we will start with. So I've had a chance at this point to review the first 4 episodes that I've done. I've edited them and looked at both the video and the audio, and I'm reasonably happy with where they were and how things went, considering this is the first time I'm doing this, and I don't really know what the hell I'm doing. In a lot of ways, I had to figure out a lot of the audio and video stuff totally on the fly. I had no idea at all what I was doing, 6 months ago. And I want it to be ultimately, I think, a little more informal than what I did in the first few episodes. Now, maybe you have listened to or watched those first few episodes and gone, that's this guy being formal? I can't say I would blame you for that kind of a reaction, but I want this to be as kind of conversational and casual as it can be, while still discussing some pretty serious and heavy topics that are not real easy, I would say, to wrap one's head around. I mean, this stuff is complicated, and I've spent a lot of years studying it and trying to understand it, and I'm still learning. But I do want to make it interesting and fun, and I think my personality is probably a little bit different from most people who teach history, and probably also from a lot of podcasters or YouTubers who do history-related content or social science-related content. Maybe that's not true, but I would tend to think that it is. And I kind of want it to be a little more my personality that's coming through in this. And so I'm going to try to kind of gravitate in that direction a bit more, and just be a bit more kind of fun and less formal. I'm still going to go through all the material in a very thorough and professional way, in the sense that I want to disclose to all you guys where I'm getting the information, and try to be as close to the facts as I can be, knowing that any kind of history teaching or any kind of history lecturing or any kind of history study is never going to be complete. It's just too hard to do. There's too much information. But this is the stuff that I feel like is most vital, I guess I would say. There's a lot of different ways to approach it. Probably the best way to explain this is that I am doing it for both an audience of people who are fairly familiar with history, and maybe even very familiar with history, and for an audience of people who are not very familiar at all with history and are just interested in learning more. And I want to try to make it both accessible to people that are not super familiar with a lot of this material, and interesting and challenging for people who maybe are familiar with a lot of this kind of thing. And I want to put my own twist on it. Ultimately, I think this will be both informative and entertaining. I think it's going to probably take me a little while to find the right balance. And if you've watched the first four or listened to the first four and you're still here and you're interested, hey, thank you, thank you, thank you. I appreciate you. This is a work in progress. I don't know what the final product is ultimately going to look like, but if you've listened to the first four or watched the first four and found them to be informative and entertaining, or maybe one and not so much the other, and you're willing to stick with me, really seriously, thank you. I'm hoping that I will continue to improve as I go through all this. Okay, all that aside, I'm now going to launch into what I have outlined for this episode. Again, it's British North America is planted. And the reason I'm putting it that way is, again, that's how the English put it. And it's also indicative of how they kind of thought of colonization of the New World. And it's a way that they practice colonization even before you get into Jamestown and Plymouth and all of the colonization that will follow in what will ultimately be the 13 American colonies that will be the first 13 American states. Planting is the specific language because they thought of it as they were starting a new society, an agricultural society, and that planting was kind of the first action that was taken in beginning a new civilization. The notion of planting a society, a civilization, stretches back to ancient times when Europeans and when African civilizations and when Asiatic civilizations and Native American civilizations all cleared areas of what had been forest or swamp or whatever and made it agriculturally viable. So going back to the ancient period, in through the Middle Ages, you had a lot of civilizations all over the world that saw creating new parts of their civilization as clearing the wild and planting a new agricultural society. And that is very much how the English thought of colonizing North America, is it's this wild place, and we're going to go there and we're going to civilize it. And the first thing that we're going to do in the interest of making it civilized is clearing the land and planting our society. And they thought this even though there were already millions of people who lived in that place. Okay? There were Native Americans, as we have discussed in the first 4 episodes, all over the Western Hemisphere, despite the existence of some very complex civilizations all over the Americas. The English kind of thought of creating their colonial societies as though they were starting from scratch, as though nothing had really existed there. And that's what the planting of North America indicates, is that from the English point of view, they're kind of starting from scratch, even though obviously, objectively, that's just not true. Okay? And it does also reveal something about the way that they looked at Native American societies, that they were obviously, in the minds of the English, inferior and in the way, and in fact preventing what the English saw as progress. So that's, I think, important to understand both for this episode and for understanding the way that colonization was undertaken going forward from Jamestown all the way up until the Revolution in the 1760s. Okay? As always, I'm going to start with the key questions that we want to try to answer by the end of this episode. That if you have understood everything that I've discussed, you should be able to answer these questions in kind of a lengthy format, like an essay or something. The first of these questions is, how did England's approach to Ireland foreshadow what English colonizers would do in North America? Okay? Second question, what challenges did Native Americans face as the English began to assert themselves in North America, and how did interactions with Native Americans dictate the way that early English colonizers built their societies? So that's a pretty long, complicated question. There's kind of two questions in one there because those things are related, and it's hard for me to think about one without thinking about the other. And then finally, what were the distinctive social, political, economic characteristics of the three regions of British North America? And I'll just go ahead and say now the regions I'm thinking of are New England, the middle colonies or the mid-Atlantic colonies, and the southern colonies. And I'll explain which colonies fit into which category and what they look like. And so by the time we're done here, you should be able to answer those questions fairly easily if everything makes sense. And again, as usual, I will share with y'all the resources that I used to put this episode together, starting with the stuff that I have on my iPad through the Kindle app. And again, I like to use the Kindle app with books because it's easy to search things, it's easy to preserve information, to take notes, and to highlight stuff that is important, and then present it to everybody else. And it's just lightweight. There are some books I have too, because I like those too, and I like to kind of go back and forth. I don't really have a strong preference, I would say, one way or the other. But in this case, there are a few of these here. And the first of them that I've referenced before is Give Me Liberty. That is an AP US textbook. After Give Me Liberty, there's a new book that I have not mentioned in any of the episodes I've done before. And I did, I think, use this book a little bit for the previous episode when I talked about the Plymouth colony. But that book is The Puritans, A Transatlantic History. And it talks about the Puritans in both Europe and in the Americas. And it's by David D. Hall, who was an academic, a scholar, specifically having studied and written about extensively Puritan societies in both Europe and in the New World. And then, of course, there's The Earth and Its Peoples, which is more of an AP World textbook. And I've referenced that because there's a lot of stuff that has to do with what is going on outside of North America and what will be the United States that is relevant to all of this. And then as far as the actual books I have here, so Before the Revolution, I've mentioned this one in each of the episodes I've done previously, and as I've said, it's great. It's really comprehensive. It has a lot to say about a lot of these different things, and I think it was really helpful to me. And then finally, there's good old American Pageant, The American Pageant, which is another AP US history book that is used in courses all over the place, and something that I've used for years. Those are the resources I'm using. These are the questions that we're going to try to answer. And first thing I'm going to get into is, as the first question suggested, Ireland. And that might seem kind of odd when we're talking about the United States and colonizing North America in the 15 into the 1600s, but it is very relevant, as you will see. First of all, Ireland was effectively a model for English colonization of the New World. What the English did in Ireland then became how they executed colonization in the New World, specifically in North America. I would say that Ireland was to England what Grenada and the Canary Islands were to Spain. And I mentioned the Canary Islands a few times in the previous episodes, that it is this series of islands in the Atlantic Ocean, closer to the west coast of Africa than to Europe, that the Spanish colonized in the late 1400s and essentially did what they would do in much of the Western Hemisphere. The Spanish started sugar plantations, they began importing slaves, and enslaving the native people in the Canary Islands. And when the Spanish achieved a level of success economically in the Canary Islands, they then transitioned that system over to the New World and did the same thing in the West Indies, in South America, in Central America, and in parts of North America that they had done in the Canary Islands. And in Grenada, Grenada is in southern Spain, and it is the sort of last piece of what is now modern Spain that the Spanish retook as a part of the Reconquista, which I had mentioned in previous episodes. It was this long process over centuries of the Spanish kicking out, often because of just straight up religious bigotry, Muslims who had settled in southern Spain after an initial invasion of Muslims in the 700-800s. And the Spanish began pushing them out in the 10th century and completed the process actually the same year that Columbus went to the New World in 1492. And Grenada was the last real stronghold of the Muslim peoples who the Spanish forced to leave as part of the Reconquista. And when the Spanish took over Grenada completely, they did in Grenada what they did in the Canary Islands. They started to import vassals, lords that took over these large estates. They began doing agriculture intensively. They changed up the system, the systems that had existed there for centuries under Muslim control. And they began to kind of just make it a lot like the rest of Spain. So what the Spanish did in Grenada and in the Canary Islands is very much what the English did do in Ireland. England's Reconquista, if you will, of Ireland began in 1169, so a long time ago. And that was not concurrent with the Norman invasion exactly, but sort of a little delayed after the Norman invasion of England that established Norman control and really kind of changed the future development of the UK, what would be the UK. And the UK, to be clear, is England, Wales, Scotland, and these days Northern Ireland. Ireland as a whole has been a part of the UK at various times. The Norman invasion meant new powers in England, and it meant the English, with the Normans in charge, tried to take over Ireland in 1169. In case you've ever wondered why a lot of Irish folks and people descended from Irish folks are kind of hostile to England and to English descended people, this is why, okay? It is a long-term relationship of exploitation and abuse that a lot of Irish people would argue is not over yet and went on for centuries. So there's a lot of animosity still between Irish people and people of Irish ancestry and people of English ancestry. And it stems from a lot of this. The Reconquista begins in the 12th century. The English do establish a foothold in East Central Ireland, and that is kind of around what is now Dublin, okay, which is the capital city, the largest city of Ireland. It, though, did not last, as most occupations don't last, especially when the people are not... I mean, occupation just implies hostility to the occupiers, right? If it wasn't occupation, we'd call it bunking up or kicking it or whatever, right? And that's not what this was. The English were trying to take over forcibly and enforce their will on Irish folks. And the Irish were hostile to that. And they had pushed the English back significantly during the 12, 13, 1400s. By 1450, the Pale, as it was called, which is the area that was controlled by the English, had shrunk to just the kind of area in and around Dublin, what is now Dublin. The English routinely described the Irish living outside of the Pale, or beyond the Pale, sound familiar, as barbarous heathens. They were not really civilized people in the eyes of the English. They practiced Catholicism, sure, but a version of Catholicism that to the, at this time, Catholic English, they're still Catholic, everybody's still Catholic in Europe in the 1400s, most everybody. And their version, the native Irish version of Catholicism, was almost kind of pagan by comparison to the English proper form of Catholicism. That was different. The English also looked at the way that the Irish farmed the land that they controlled and said that that was backward. They were not making progress. They were not being as advanced, as civilized as the English were in the view of the English. There was a noticeable difference because the advances of the medieval period in agriculture really didn't make their way to Ireland at this time, from what I've read. There wasn't the 3-field system and rotation of crops as had been the case in continental Europe and in England. So there was something, at least, that English folks who wanted to say that people in Ireland were not as advanced, were barbarous heathens. There was something they could point to say, yeah, you're not as advanced as we are. That provides a permission structure, effectively, for a whole range of exploitation that goes on from the 1400s into, really, the 20th century. It's almost impossible for me to hear these things, and this is intentional. This is something I'm trying to do, is to present what the English are saying about the Irish and compare it to what the English would say about Native Americans. Okay? The English said that the Irish were barbarous heathens, that they were backward, that they were not civilized. And it's the same kind of thing that they would say about Native Americans over the centuries as they tried to colonize North America. The English and Irish parliaments finally acknowledge Henry VIII in the early 1500s as king rather than just as lord vassal. Well, Henry VIII took over in the early 1500s and as king, and it wasn't until 1541 officially that there was the Crown of Ireland Act, and the Irish gentry and Irish citizens were sort of forced to say, okay, he's your king, and you have to accept it. Elizabeth I, after her father died, and after there was it was kind of a rocky road for Elizabeth to take over as queen, as any of you who know something about the Tudor family know. But when she did, she began a forceful conquest of Ireland in 1565. So took it from, we're going to try to expand our foothold in Ireland, to we're going to just take over the place. And that's that. Most of this conquest was done privately rather than by the state. And what I mean by that is that it wasn't English armies per se that were going in there and taking over these places. No, instead, it was very similar to the conquistador model, in which guys like Cortez and Pizarro, who took over the Aztec and the Inca Empire respectively, they sort of did their own thing and didn't get a lot of guidance or rules put in place by the Spanish crown when they went to the New World and tried to take over these places. And that is very much what the English conquistadors did in Ireland. They were given the directive or the permission to go over there and take things over, and they kind of took it and ran with it. Provided their own soldiers in a lot of cases. And it was something that attracted people who thought they could make a lot of money, which is, I think, not necessarily the kind of people that you want going into a place to try to establish authority, because generally they're going to look out for what's best for their pocketbooks and how they're going to benefit the most, and not necessarily what is good for establishing a sound footing for political rule. Humphrey Gilbert and Richard Grenville, who are the half-brother, that's Gilbert, and cousin, that's Grenville, of Sir Walter Raleigh, who's a very important character we'll get to, they cut their teeth for what they will do in Roanoke in Ireland. So they sort of learn how to establish colonies and become conquistadors in Ireland. They hoped to establish feudal estates, much the same way that the conquistadors did, which meant that they would take over these huge swaths of land and they would get the natives to work on their behalf, and they would sit back and collect a bunch of money. It's great work if you can get it, if you can just kick back and collect the money of other people who labor for you, right? They wanted to establish these feudal states in Ireland and then looked to repeat the process in North America when they went there. As with Spain in the West Indies and Mexico and so forth, the Irish were unilaterally declared English subjects by the English conquistadors and the monarchs and parliament of England and of Ireland under English control. So this was very similar to when the Spanish would kind of announce to Native Americans, hey, we're in charge now, in Spanish. And the Native Americans probably looked at them like, the hell are you saying? Huh? Irish resistance movements sprang up almost immediately, as you can imagine, because Irish people are not super cool with the English just coming in there and announcing, we're in charge now, you work for us. There is a resistance movement initially in 1559, and that is even before Elizabeth I announces her conquest because, as we've already said, there's been an English presence in Ireland for centuries at this point, and even before Elizabeth announces in 1565 that there's going to be this great English conquest of Ireland, her father had already said that I'm the king, and the Irish Parliament agreed to it. So there was a resistance movement in 1559. In 1568, another one began that didn't end really until 1583. And there's another resistance movement from 1594 to 1603. Each time, these resistance movements are brutally repressed. And I'm talking about mass executions, people imprisoned, anybody who's even suspicious is thrown in jail or killed, and not a lot of due process in all of this stuff. It certainly does not endear the English in any way to Irish folks. Again, in the view of English people, the Irish were savages, brutes, uncivilized heathens, and pagans, and they had to be made civilized. And this is the ethos that the English have the entire time they are trying to take over and conquer Ireland. So, we've talked a little about what was going on with the English and how it was that they prepared, essentially, for colonizing North America. I want to talk now about what was going on with Native Americans. And look, this part of what I'm going to discuss, it's not awesome. It's not super fun to hear about what was happening. It's in fact very, very sad. If you know something about the really tragic history of Native Americans, of indigenous people in many places that Europeans eventually took over as colonizing began in the 1600s and then extended into the 17 and 1800s and kind of into the early 20th century, it's not a great story for the indigenous people. But I do think there's a way in which discussing the indigenous folks as victims is oversimplification and really doesn't do them the credit that they deserve. Because they had agency in some cases, and the odds were very much stacked against them, particularly when it comes to diseases, as we've talked about in previous episodes with the Columbian Exchange and so forth. But I think it's diminishing who they were and what they were capable of, not to talk about what their societies were like and the choices they made in terms of interacting with Europeans or not. And so that's something I want to get into right now. The English, as they had done with the Irish, they looked at Native Americans as lesser than, certainly, as heathens, barbarians, uncivilized people. When they arrived in North America, largely in the late 15, early 1600s to establish permanent settlements anyway. They saw the New World as another island to be civilized. And it was early settlers, again, like Humphrey Gilbert, like Richard Grenville, like Sir Walter Raleigh, like John Smith, and so forth, that saw the Native Americans through the same lens as they saw the Irish. But, as we have discussed in previous episodes, there were these complex, thriving Native American civilizations that tended to be grouped together as a monolith, and that Europeans, the English in particular, were notorious and kind of bad about this. They didn't see the distinctions in native societies. And there's some what we would now call racism in there. There's very definitely an inferiority complex in there. And there's also just a drive and ambition to conquer and just get everybody who's in your way the fuck out of your way. That's how they saw it. It was merciless and greedy and does not reflect well from our modern values on the Europeans in general and on the English in particular. Natives in North America, though, before all this happened, had already had about a century of interactions with Europeans. Remember that they were trading with the French, with the Dutch, with the Spanish, and various other Europeans who came in on missions looking for natural resources of various kinds. Precious metals, sure, but also pelts and furs and the other things we've talked about. Tribal leaders and many others in Native American societies who didn't necessarily hold positions of authority or prestige desired European trade goods, and I'm talking about wampum, which takes many different forms. I'll have a picture in there in the YouTube video for anybody who's watching that. But it's I think it's kind of difficult to describe wampum singularly. It has a few different forms, but that's one thing. Iron and steel weapons and tools, knives, were very, very important to Native Americans. They were a lot sturdier and sharper and more effective in battle and for hunting than the stone, obsidian, wood knives that Native Americans, bone knives that Native Americans had before Europeans arrived. There's also tools of other stripes, cloth, muskets, and some consumer goods like mirrors and combs and things like that. The utility and prestige attached to these things is really important for Native Americans. There's this concept of power that I have discussed in previous episodes, and it's one of the ways that it manifests itself in Native societies is that having these prestigious goods demonstrates power to others in Native American societies. It shows that you, the possessor of a European knife or of wampum or of a silk robe, if you had those things, it showed that you were worthy of respect. Cooperation and respect for elders and respect for people with not necessarily money or land, but with other forms of prestige, whether it's goods or wisdom or leadership or combat ability. There's respect for those things among Native American societies in a way that there isn't so much in European societies. And so getting your hands on these goods wasn't just a matter of utility for Native Americans. It was also a matter of being able to project power and respect. Natives had been trading pelts of deer mostly, furs of beaver mostly, food and slaves for these goods that they got, whether it's knives or wampum or what have you, for most of the 1500s by the time we get to the point that we're discussing. In the late 1500s, that's when things really start to go badly for Native Americans in North America. In the late 1500s, there is only what can be described as a demographic crisis for Native Americans. The tribes are hit by waves and waves of epidemics, of measles, of influenza, of smallpox, of all of those kinds of things in the Great Lakes region, in New England, in northeastern Canada, in the East and Gulf coasts of the United States. It's everywhere. Perhaps as much as 90 to 95%. 90 to 95% of some tribal communities north of Mexico and east of the Mississippi died from 1580 to 1650. Obviously, these are estimates. Exact figures are really difficult to come by because there's no census. There are not social scientists really to speak of, either in European or Native American societies at this point. So these are estimations based on what written records do exist, burial rites. There are evangelical Christians, both Catholic and Protestant, who are reaching out to these Native communities and seeing this demographic devastation and recording it and talking about it. It's haunting. I mean, how could it not be? If you looked around and saw 9 out of 10 of the people that you knew dying, how would that not traumatize you? How would you not think that this is like some cataclysmic end of world event? I mean, we just went through the COVID pandemic, and that was a big deal. And you're talking about, I forget what the exact figures were. I mean, I think it was like 1 or 2 or 3% mortality, and that was devastating to a lot of places. So imagine 90% of the people that you know dying and what that would do to your psyche and to those who survived. It's got to be awful. What happens as a result of it is that more powerful tribes who had greater populations and therefore could recover, they went on the warpath. That's how they decided to cope. That's how they thought they could get past it and move on to the next stage of their civilization. And I'm talking about tribes like the Iroquois, Haudenosaunee, whatever you want to call them, the group of 5 to 6, depending on which period you're talking about, tribes in what is now upstate New York, the Mohawk and the Oneida and so forth. And then the Susquehannock is another big, powerful tribe. They went on the warpath, mostly to rebuild their devastated populations. They wanted to take captive and ingratiate into their societies folks from smaller Native American tribes who couldn't really resist them. And eventually, a lot of these smaller tribes become absorbed into the larger tribes. The smaller tribes couldn't resist both because of the demographic crisis that hit them harder in many instances than the larger tribes, and because some of these larger tribes had been trading for years for European weapons, and not just knives or edge weapons made of steel and iron, but muskets. By the 1660s, many tribal nations had been absorbed into larger tribal societies and kind of ceased to exist. Not entirely, and it's too difficult to generalize and say that all of a sudden all the smaller tribes just evaporated. That would be oversimplifying it. But I do think, based on what I've read, that it would be accurate to say that a lot of the diversity that existed among Native American tribes at least diminished, if did not entirely disappear. Because these larger tribes like the Iroquois, Haudenosaunee, and the Susquehannock just absorbed the smaller tribes, and those smaller tribal nations were assimilated into the larger tribal nations, and their way of being, the smaller tribal nations, those peoples, their way of being began to disappear, or at the very least blend in with the larger Native American societies. And best guess from other civilizations I have studied over the time that I've done this and taught this stuff, there's probably a little a column A, a little a column B thing going on here. It's probably the case that larger tribes absorb some of the cultural practices and ways of being of the smaller tribes, and vice versa. It wasn't just a one-way street, would be my guess, because if you look at societies, for example, like the Mongol Empire comes to mind immediately. That was a civilization that took over vast numbers of other civilizations, and in many instances what the Mongols did was to adopt the ways of being of the people that they conquered, rather than the other way around. So there's probably some of that goes on, and I don't know enough about how native societies function to say how much of what went on where. But I think it's reasonable to assume, based on other things I've studied and based on what I did read, that there was probably a little bit of both. However, all of this chaos certainly, and from the English point of view, from the settlers, you got to think that probably even makes it a little more confusing to determine which tribes are which and whose practices are whose and who belongs where, as all this mixing together is going on. Maybe most importantly, all of this chaos made Native American tribes a lot more vulnerable to English colonization in the 1600s. If they're suffering from all this disease and population loss, and there's infighting among them, obviously that's going to make them easier for the English to conquer, and or to just push out of the way, which is ultimately what they did. Thank you so much for sticking with me. Not just all of the serious stuff. I want to be informative, but I also want to try to make this fun and entertaining, because I think there's no reason it can't be both. So, thank you for sticking with me. I appreciate it. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you found it informative. If you would like to contact me, please reach out at howthehelldidwegetherepod@gmail.com, or you can text or call at 951-525-5536. Give me your thoughts. I'd love to hear them. Seriously, I'm sure it will be amusing whether they're good or bad. Thanks again. Take care. I will catch you guys next time around. All right?